Welcome everyone to this session on just transitions and managing the fossil fuel decline, which is held at the Bartlett at UCL, University College London. It's a title which is very unapologetic about the fact that we do need to transition towards a decarbonized future. And it's also part of the Bartlett's Together for Climate Action campaign. And there is a website for that. And essentially what this is about leading up to the COP26, which is to be held in Glasgow. We have the opportunity to engage on some of the key issues in terms of taking action on climate. So we would be hearing from our world-leading experts at the Bartlett and beyond, and some other guests as well, what's going on in this space. What is, why is it so important, and what we can do to create change. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event. Now, as the audience, you can submit questions using the Q&A at the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point during the webinar. Just to lay out a little bit of the background about the panel discussion today, we know that the international community has committed to the Paris Agreement to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees centigrade and pursue efforts to limit to the 1.5 degrees centigrade. Since then, we've seen the 1.5 degree special report by the IPCC and a whole host of other work that has articulated the urgency of this issue. So the goal of achieving the climate, the temperature goal will not be achieved without substantial reduction in the rates of fossil fuel production and use. This will require that most fossil fuel reserves to be left in the ground. So this decline in fossil fuel production and use would need to be rapid and no doubt would cause major disruption to the fossil fuel industry, including the loss of government revenues, cuts to shareholder payouts, job losses, etc. So as a global community, we may be facing in the right direction, but not necessarily moving fast enough to avert the climate crisis. As the 2020 production gap report alerts us, many countries have signaled continued production of fossil fuels, essentially in complete misalignment with the Paris goals. So this gives us reason to question on how such decline in fossil fuel production and use can be managed in a just and equitable and fair manner that respects the need of countries, companies, and communities that are going to be impacted by such a transition. So in this event, a diverse panel of experts on the topic will bring their perspectives on what a just transition for fossil fuel sector might look like and how it's going to be managed or how it should be managed, and some of the key challenges that we would need to overcome. So we have 4 excellent panelists who come from different sectors who will give us their insight. So I'll introduce them one by one. Kate James is a senior policy advisor at the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS. At BEIS, Kate works on the UK's Powering Past Coal Alliance initiative with a focus on just transitions. The second panelist is Sian Bradley, who's a senior research fellow in the Energy, Environment and Resources program at Chatham House. Sian works on climate risk and transition pathways with a focus on fossil fuel producers and mining economies. Sian will bring her expertise with the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to this discussion. Adrian Vogt Schilb is a senior climate change economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. And Adrian's work focuses on the design of effective and politically acceptable climate strategies. So Adrian will bring the whole issue of the development partners and the kinds of challenges and opportunities that they would be looking at. Greg Mutit is a senior policy advisor on energy supply and at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Greg has over 20 years of research experience on fossil fuels and climate change, focusing on the economics and politics of energy transitions. So I will kick off with the first question. My panelists, welcome to this session. I'll give you 3 minutes each to reflect on question one. So the question is, what are the key elements of a strategy that embeds just transitions thinking as it relates to the phase out of fossil fuel production? May I start with Siân? Welcome, Siân.
Hi there, Jakob. It's great to be joining today's discussion, and so thank you to UCL for the invitation and for putting this agenda, this issue on the London Climate Action Week agenda. And I should also stress that I'm here with my Chatham House hat on, so I'll focus my comments on our work with oil and gas producers. Look, the discussion around the phase out of fossil fuels and supply side measures that can help deliver this is a fairly recent thing within international climate policy. And this discussion about fairness in transition has really been brought to the fore by the work that has been done by UCL on the distribution of unburnable carbon, by the UN production gap that has really brought this disparity between stated climate policies and planned oil and gas production into sharp relief. And then, of course, we've had the IEA Net Zero report and its landmark statement that there's no space for new oil and gas beyond what's already under development, no need for exploration. And so that's really creating space for conversations like this. And it's a critical shift because we can throw as much finance and support as we like at green resilient sectors of the economy. But if we don't start seriously engaging with the major barriers to transition, and by that I mean the political economy around the fossil fuel industry, we're not going to be able to deliver the kind of structural transformation that is required to keep 1.5 degrees in sight. Now, to your question on what are the elements of a strategy that embeds justice, I mean, the critical question here is what resonates at country level and what's possible at country level. And I hope we have a few producer country participants on the call today, as well as the London crowd, who can maybe comment and come in on this. I and colleagues at Chatham House have been working on this question for many years with producer countries, with donors, with development banks, and it's been a long, slow process of building understanding of climate-related risks and opportunities and really supporting countries in assessing how these might affect their sustainable development goals. So normalising discussions around transition risks and their impacts and building the capacities that are required to identify and manage these risks at the national level. And there's a huge amount of work still to do here. Most producer countries are in the really early stages of building these sorts of capacities. Now, what the COVID crisis has really done over the last 18 months is expose the vulnerability of the oil and gas sector and effectively bring forwards a lot of transition risks. And it's raised these issues of equity and resilience, both within countries and between countries. And this is creating space to push forwards new dialogues and new work. And I'll just flag three, and then perhaps we can come back to them in the discussion. The first is the most, the obvious one about how transition risks flow through producer economies and affect individuals, right? So it's about the distributional impacts of transition risks. So if we look at, how transition risks run through an oil and gas producing state, it's basically the same way as the supposed benefits do. We're talking about three areas: economic impacts related to revenues, energy and industrial impacts related to this locking in of fossil fuel dependency, and employment and supply chain impacts, so direct impacts, what's typically called local content. And in each case, the distributional impacts have not been front and centre so far, because the awareness raising and capacity building is typically focused on national level first, but this needs to be a priority going forwards. The second obvious area is around the procedural justice and the drivers of change. So we know there's a need for enhanced data and disclosures from the oil and gas sector, and a real meaningful public dialogue and engagement on how to manage transition risks and how to plan for a just transition. And so this is an area where we've been working with the EITI to help, again, build understanding of the information and tools that can support these ends. And then the final point really is about the changing global context for these discussions. And, you know, the simple fact that we need to go beyond talking about managing risks around the oil and gas sector and managing carbon to enhance the resilience of production, to actively talking about Paris-aligned dates for phase out and what a political commitment to manage decline looks like. And these need to be country-led discussions. You know, this was something that was typically out of bounds for advisors and assistants to producer countries because the decision to extract is a sovereign one. And it absolutely still is. But the reality is that setting timeframes and planning for a managed decline early is the clearest way to manage risk and, of course, to facilitate investment in producer countries. And if we don't do that, there's a very real risk that we have oil and gas producing countries, and particularly the least developed and least able to bear the burden of climate-related financial risks, all competing for that last 25% of the oil market or last 45% of the gas market that would be left in place under the IEA's net zero scenario, and increasing the scale of their losses and missing critical opportunities to plan for a just transition. So I'll leave it there and we can come back to these points in discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Sian. Now let me turn to you, Greg. I mean, we heard Sian talking about, you know, the whole question around distribution impact of transition risk, but also, you know, procedural justice. So in a sense, you know, she's outlined some of the key pathways by which, you know, we can engage with this issue, as well as the elephant in the room, which is politics. So I'll turn to you and see where, you know, if you can add any thoughts to that list.
Well, thanks very much, Jakob. And perhaps I'll start by echoing Sian's last point, which is about the importance of today's session and the conversation we're having now, which is that we're planning ahead to manage the fossil fuel decline. As you pointed out, Jakob, the production gap report shows that governments are still planning to increase their production of fossil fuels, or even to maximize their production of fossil fuels. And essentially, by doing so, they're putting off the problem for later. And if we don't act now to plan and to manage the decline, then we're not going to end up with a just transition. We're going to end up with a very unjust and disruptive transition. The other point I wanted to make is that for me, a just transition is one that is just for everyone, that respects the rights of everyone who is affected by it. And it's important in this context to think of how different communities, different types of people are affected by the transition. Of course, a key constituency we think of first is fossil fuel workers and the local communities whose economies depend on production. Just transition is crucial for them. But also we need to remember that there are communities who are negatively impacted by fossil fuel production, by pollution or by militarization. We think of, for instance, the Niger Delta or parts of the Amazon. And we need to ensure that the rights of both groups are respected. We need to think about the difference between different countries. For instance, here in the UK, oil and gas account for less than 0.1% of government revenue. In Angola, it's nearly half of government revenue comes from oil and gas. In Iraq, it's about 85%. And so there are very different challenges in those different contexts. And then finally, some people think about just transition as meaning a slower pace of change, a slower reduction of fossil fuel production. And I would argue that's a mistake. That's essentially trading off one group of people's rights against another group of people's. It would be prioritizing the rights of coal miners over the rights of, for instance, farmers or shellfishers who can be very vulnerable to climate change. And so I would argue that just transition should shape how we go about a transition in countries. It should provide for social dialogue, for social protection, for job creation and retraining. It shouldn't be shaping the pace. The pace needs to be shaped by avoiding the worst dangers of climate change. So to wrap that up, I think we really need to think about how do we respect the rights of all of these different groups who are affected by the transition and not trade off one group against another group.
Many thanks, Greg. I'll now turn to you, Kate, partly because I think what Greg has outlined which is the whole question around the social dialogue and respecting the rights of all people. And I could also see you nodding your head. It's something that you wanted to add to, I think. So please take the floor.
Thanks, Jakob, and thanks to UCL. And it's particularly lovely to be invited. I'm actually from UCL many decades ago, of the alumni of UCL. So it's very nice to be back. So I really agree with Sian and all Greg's points, and particularly picking up on that point that Greg was making around that inclusive conversation. I think it's fair to say the UK has not always been great at this. We don't have collective sectorial bargaining or structures like this that much of Europe and actually around the world have. These constitutional mechanisms by which you can bring together communities. But we have in the UK government done things like the Green Task Force at the moment, which is bringing together the trade unions, employers, etc., into one forum to work out how and where you're moving workers to and what those barriers are. I think also there are some really good examples, and I think Sian mentioned about COVID and the devastating impacts COVID have had on our communities, but also the structures they've started to build. There is these mechanisms now around the world because governments have necessarily had to put them in place to make these quick deals, whether it's like furlough in the UK or closures, etc. And so there is now started to be these forums brought together where different constituents are coming together to have an emergency conversation in pretty devastating situations, but there's the opportunity to keep those going actually and change them into that dialogue for the future, and agree entirely with Greg that I don't think we should get into the route of trading communities off against each other, but also it must be an inclusive conversation, but also an inclusive conversation across borders. We've seen the moves in Germany around supply chains, and the moves around changing their laws on supply chains, and I think that's a positive and interesting move. And obviously there's discussions going on at the Council of Europe, of which the UK is still a member, going on around ethical supply chains, and of course, you know, that's a real necessity when you're talking about solar panels and the green energy revolution. A lot of it is from the extractive industry, and it doesn't always have a glowing history to it. And also where a lot of that extraction can be is on indigenous land, in the Amazon, other really vital places of environment. Just the other point I'd finally make is also it's the reason dialogue is so important. It's to get into the nitty-gritty. I am a Whitehall civil servant, and quite rightly we get criticised for being in our ivory tower and developing policy without real engagement, and we just can't take that risk. We know how fast this has to move, and we can't take the risk that we make the wrong policy interventions. And actually, when you talk to communities, you talk to workers, you talk to employers, they know their workforce, they know their community knows what they could do in the future, what skills they have, what they don't have, what is the art of the possible. But they also know the nuances of things like, you know, our oil and gas workers have said, actually, there was a recent survey, we'd love to go and work on wind farms and things like that. We think it would be a really great move for us. But we've got this little barrier where the qualifications we currently have aren't recognised in the wind sector. That's a nuance we hadn't thought about, and we need to break down those barriers to make it much easier for those workers to move over. In the same way, thinking about you know, our labour statute book, is it conducive to ensure, just because it's a green job doesn't mean miraculously it's going to come out with high pay and be beautiful and wonderful and dignified just because it's green. You know, we've got some examples in solar and wind of, you know, some pretty bad practices, including illegal practices. And so it is looking at that legislative statute book as well, and making sure that the framework is conducive. So the jobs that you are investing in, whether in the private sector, the public sector, pump out the other end the kind of jobs that are good for others. It's not a lot of use if you say to a coal miner in South Africa, I've got this wonderful job for you, great, not going to be breathing in all the fumes anymore, it's half the wages, oh, it's also on the other side of the country, and it's half the hours. Not a lot of use. I need all of my wages to pay my rent, to pay my mortgage, to feed my family. Not a lot of use. So it's starting to get into, that's why that dialogue is so important, because for us in Whitehall, we won't know all of these things. We won't know all those nuances of detail. And having that granularity of detail and that knowledge really does sit in communities. They know the issues, they know the problems, they know, you know, if they are able to move around. It's a bit of a fallacy that people move around. Actually, most people live and work in the same place they were born. And so, you know, they do have that granularity of detail, and having that social dialogue really unlocks it and means that you can go a lot faster. And then just picking up on a final point, certainly that dialogue process also means that it's longer than a life cycle of Parliament. Obviously in the UK, we're on a roughly, we haven't been recently, but roughly a 5-year parliamentary life cycle, political life cycle. That's not very long to develop policies and actually for policies to be out on the ground and then starting to see the fruition of those policies. You need something a lot more long term. And given that climate policies and adaptation policies to deliver the mitigations need 10, 20 years, that's suddenly, you know, a lot of political life cycles. But whereas if you have that dialogue, they live on beyond, because the community hold the politicians, the voters hold the politicians, because they were part of formulating these policies. So they go beyond a next parliament. And you see that largely in the UK with just we do not fortunately have quite the same problems around climate change denial or etc. You know, they have cut across the political barriers of kind of whichever party roughly is in power, but the policies to deliver against that haven't yet, and social dialogue can be a real bulwark against those, that what we see as diplomats in Parliament. You know, you get somewhere with an international government, then there's an election, it changes again, you're starting from scratch again. And actually, if there's already a kind of consensus within your population, because they've been involved in this dialogue and development of policies, that actually lives beyond the political cycle of elections. So I'll just leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. I'll turn to you, Adrian, now. I mean, you work in the development space, international development of, you know, different countries, their experiences. I mean, what are the three, what would you say are the key elements that we need to embed in just transitions when you're looking at particularly countries in the South?
Thank you so much, Jacob, for the introduction and the invitation. Maybe answering by giving just a bit of context. I think you put it very clearly at the beginning. We definitely need to get to net zero emissions to put an end to the climate crisis. And that means getting rid of fossil fuels in particular. Now, in Latin America and the Caribbean, where I focus, there's basically two big things that all countries can do to get rid of fossil fuels. The first one is to replace coal, natural gas, and diesel power plants with renewable energy, basically. And the second one is to replace diesel buses and gasoline cars with electric vehicles. So to be sure, there's more to do to get to net zero emissions, but that's the two big buckets of getting rid of fossil fuels. And I really wanted to emphasize something that the other speakers haven't said so much, which is, first, there's a piece of good news. And the piece of good news is that doing so is not a sacrifice. You know, today, renewable energy is the cheapest source of new electricity around the world. And electric vehicles are still a bit more expensive to buy than diesel and gasoline vehicles, but they're also much cheaper to operate. So in many cases, they're already cheaper to own over the lifetime. And, you know, in the coming years, they're definitely going to become cheaper than the fossil fuel alternatives. So because of things like that, in the last IDB macroeconomic report, we emphasized that a transition to net zero emission is an opportunity to create 1% of additional growth in the region and also 15 million net new jobs by 2030. So if it's good news that transitioning to net zero is good for the economy and for jobs, why do we need to talk about a just transition? Well, my answer is that even if it's good overall, the problem is that it creates winners and losers within countries, right? So just to give you an example, and I know many people have already talked about this, we did a study in Chile about what would be the labor impact of closing down all coal power plants in the country. And basically we find it would create, 8,000 new jobs in that, but it would also destroy 4,000 jobs in coal power plants. So to be clear, 4,000 jobs at the scale of an economy like Chile is not a systemic impact. Before COVID, Chile would create 40,000 jobs per trimester. And here we're talking 4,000 jobs by the time you close all the coal power plants. But the issue is for these people, it's all of their revenues, all of their livelihood. And as it's been said, in some communities, it represents like all the blood of the town. Basically, there's half a dozen towns in Chile where all the coal power plants are focused. And in the most affected, it's like 8% of population works in the coal power plant. So that's why you need a just transition. And the just transition, we issued a book with the International Labour Organization last July called Jobs in a Net Zero Emission Future in Latin America. And we defined the just transition with three things. The first one is to ensure that the potential benefits that I mentioned of the transition actually happen. I haven't heard many people talk about this today yet. So, make sure that you're actually going to create jobs in renewable energy, that people have the skills to do it, that you're going to have the industry locally, and that you're not just going to import them all, for instance. The second point is, acknowledge and address the fact that you're going to create losers. And the third one is to make sure that everybody affected by climate policy has a voice and takes a part in decision making. So don't have just technocrats in Washington write the climate policy of your country, but instead write it with the communities in Chile affected by the coal phase down, for instance. So that's the context. I'm sure we can talk a bit more about it during the questions. Thanks a lot again.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. So I'll move in a sense, it kind of fits into our next question, which is I'll kick off with you, Greg. For a just transition, the question is it reasonable to expect that developing countries that are heavily dependent on essentially revenues from fossil fuels historically, but even those who are beginning to enter into the fossil fuel or beginning to produce as producers? We know that, for example, Mozambique, Uganda, and various other countries and Ghana have begun to enter into that space. So the question is, how would they transition? What is our expectation in terms of their transition? What should be the pace? What should be our kind of thinking? I just wondered if you could give us an absolutely frank, no hands off, type of a response, please, Greg.
I'll do my best. I think I would draw a distinction between the two different types of developing countries you described. One where economies are already dependent on fossil fuel revenues, and the other where there is a future prospect or hope of fossil fuel revenues. And I think the starting point for this discussion is the sheer urgency of the climate crisis. We know from the IPCC that the carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is just 11 years of current global emissions. This transition needs to be happening now and needs to be happening rapidly. Now, as production and consumption of fossil fuels decline, as emissions decline, essentially the bulk of fossil fuels need to be phased out in the next 3 decades or so, the majority of them. And that is the timescale we're working to. Now, of course, there's a big difference between economies that are dependent on fossil fuel revenues. I mentioned Angola or Iraq earlier. There are many other examples we could give, and those that are less dependent, like the UK or like Norway or like the US or Canada. And I think the clear lesson from the differing challenges they face, both the resources they can invest in a transition, but also the difficulty of going through that transition means it has to be slower for those more dependent countries. It's a basic principle of justice that those who can do more or can do more easily should do more, and those for whom it's more difficult should be slower. But the flip side of that is that the wealthy and diversified economies need to move a lot faster than that 3-decade timescale. We need to be seeing a wind down of production on a much more rapid timescale. And so it's troubling that all of those countries I mentioned are still licensing new fossil fuel production that could still be producing in the 2050s. I think that's upside down. On the other hand, the other type of developing countries, the likes of Mozambique, that are hoping to go down this road and gain future revenues from this. I think the problem we have here is that there's a race between, on the one hand, what's sometimes called the green paradox, the rush to extract before the transition happens, and on the other hand, the resource curse. We know from studying fossil fuel dependent economies that you tend to get worse economic outcomes the quicker you try to develop. And those countries which have had better economic or institutional outcomes, like for instance Norway, have deliberately gone slowly. And those two things crash into each other. Going slowly is no longer an option. Going quickly to try and get ahead of the transition will make countries likely victim to the resource curse. So I would echo what the IEA said last month, that there is no longer a viable development pathway from new fossil fuels. There is no room for new oil fields, gas fields, or coal mines if the world is to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming. And given these systemic factors, this is not a good development pathway. So the distinction between the two countries is, yes, slower for dependent economies. It has to be, because the problem is so difficult where you have high levels of dependence. But the flip side of that is countries like the UK need to move a lot faster. And for those that aren't yet dependent, my advice would be, don't get dependent.
Thanks, Greg. Now let me turn to you, Adrian. I mean, you work in Multilateral Development Bank, and
oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. So you have a pretty good sense of how these investments actually work. So I mean, the question is, should funders be considering oil and gas projects in developing countries? I mean, we outlined, two different types of two categories. One, those ones, who are already locked in, and therefore we have to find a way to kind of wean them out. But then those countries that haven't yet gone in, that are really stumbling into it, what do we do?
No, that's a great question, and I really agree with what Greg said and the way he emphasized that the main problem we have is that it's way too urgent to imagine a development path that depends on fossil fuels. The problem that these countries are facing is that fossil fuels assets are becoming liabilities. We have 30 years, it's extremely short, and the transition is already happening. Whatever countries like Guyana or Ecuador do, the rest of the world is advancing with renewable energy, with electric vehicles. Renewable energy last year represented more than 80% of all capacity additions around the world. And it's been like that for years, that renewable energy is dominating new electricity additions. Peak coal was back in 2013. BP and the IEA said that we may have already passed peak oil. It could have been in 2019. Time will tell, but it could have been. Peak gasoline cars could also have passed in 2019. So the transition is already happening. In the region, we don't have the kind of dependency that Greg mentioned. Like in some countries, it's more than 5% of revenues. From the top of my head, Bolivia, Ecuador, Trinidad, and Tobago. Of course, Venezuela has a even higher, much higher share, but other countries is more like 5 to 10%. But even for them, it's very important. We have a study actually with UCL that shows that by 2035, in only 15 years, 2/3 of the oil reserves in the region would remain unburned if the rest of the world continues with the energy transition. That again is already happening. And that would mean $3 trillion in cumulative royalties lost for the countries. So I would say the more you depend on fossil fuels, the more urgent it is to start thinking about diversification of your economy and diversification of your fiscal strategy.
Thank you, Adrian. Sean and Kate, I mean, did you want to sort of come into in this question?
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly to, I mean, I want to pick up on Greg's earlier point about pitching groups against one another. This is so important. And, you know, it's worth noting that the structure of oil and gas markets is very, very different to coal in that respect. You know, the vast majority of coal is produced and consumed in the same country. Oil and gas, particularly for developing countries, is typically an export industry, and it's actually been very, very difficult to develop local content, local employment, and to finance fossil fuel infrastructure. And those countries that have gone that route, countries such as Ghana, have experienced huge delays in energy insecurity and overblown expenses along the way as a result of that, of those challenges. So it's important to just acknowledge the very, very, very different starting point. And as Greg said, in many cases, there will be community impacts and sort of opportunity costs that developing countries have experienced, rather than this sort of large scale labor displacement that we see in more developed economies and in coal producing regions. So it's really important to note that. And as Adrian said, you know, to make sure that the benefits of the transition happen. And it's quite likely to be the case that for many emerging prospective oil and gas producers, the just transition actually should be a huge opportunity for greening domestic demand and supporting the growth of clean, resilient jobs. And I mean, on that note, just on your question, you know, is it a reasonable expectation that developing countries should move more slowly? Look, first of all, there is absolutely a moral responsibility for advanced economies to take the lead here. And it's crucial to maintaining trust in the Paris Agreement. So unequivocally, developed economies should take the lead in setting and implementing the policies that can support a managed decline of the sector and in ramping up their financial support for transition. But when it comes to developing countries, yeah, we're talking about very, very different groups. These countries that already have entrenched dependencies, and then the emerging producers. And it's worth thinking about the types of dependencies we're dealing with. So I mentioned at the outset, you know, we can think of this in terms of economic dependence, energy and industrial dependence, employment dependence. There is nothing to stop these countries greening domestic supply and demand as fast as possible. And actually that can help free up fiscal space to invest in transition and help sort of shield from the volatility and the risks of oil markets as they decline. So that's a really, really important point to make, because typically when countries are locked in this fossil fuel dependency cycle, their domestic consumption rises and rises, and it tends to cut into their exports and ultimately their foreign exchange over time. Managing that early and setting in place the policies and the frameworks and seeking investment to green domestic demand is something that all producers can be moving fast on, or moving faster than they are on, with the right support and assistance. And this is the key here.
Thank you, Sean. I mean, in alignment with that, Kate, if I could turn to you, because what we've heard from Sean and Adrian and Greg to a large extent is that energy itself is operating in a kind of globalized sort of setting. You know, you have the developed north and the global south, and of course a lot of the resources, or perhaps even resources that are going to yet to be discovered, we're talking about fossil fuel, tend to be in the developing south. Now the question is, you know, in terms of, you know, the responsibility issue that Sean just laid out, you know, that there is no question that if we look at, you know, historical pathways, developed countries have benefited, you know, from cheap oil and fossil fuels and so forth. So now we're asking developing countries to essentially disengage, you know, from that tried and tested energy model. So what is the responsibility there for developed countries in trying to provide the necessary support, and or is there a role for them? So I mean, for example, should the UK and other developed countries do more by declining their production of fossil fuel, but is there anything else that they can do as well to try and encourage others not to take that route?
Yeah, thanks. And it's a very good question, and something we're actually looking at in COP26. Of course, a key driver for the UK government in COP26 is to up the commitments for international climate financing. The UK has huge commitments, and we are calling on countries around the world, to developed countries around the world, to up the money and support to developing and emerging economies to make that transition faster. And of course, underpinning Paris is that justice underneath international climate financing. But something I'm leading on COP26 is looking at the role that we play as developed countries in utilising, whether it's our overseas development assistance or our aid budget or our climate financing, embedding within it principles that support just transition elsewhere. And by that I mean some labour principles, supply chain principles, environmental principles, because I think what we've seen is where we have had some very successful projects, so for example financing wind farms in South Africa or Morocco, etc., that's not always seen all the benefits on the ground. It may have produced cleaner generation, but sometimes electricity prices have gone up, and also it hasn't expanded provision of electricity. And quite a lot of those projects are, of course, UK, Norwegian, Danish, in the wind sector in particular, companies coming in and building, and they haven't created local jobs. I think Adrian mentioned Chile. Chile's quite a good example. There is the biggest copper mine in the world is in the north of Chile. Right outside that copper mine is a wind farm run by Enel. I went to see the copper miners there. They absolutely hate it. They say, do you see any workers there? You don't see any. So they said, if that's your climate change, no, thank you very much. Electricity prices also went up. And of course, what work there is, the high value work tends to go to Italians or others. And you see that quite a lot. And so we are driving forward a commitment to support higher labour standards so those workers can move over and can get other jobs, and commitment to creating local jobs, and that they are local jobs for local people, and that we put in place and align financial funding. If one programme can't do everything because of the rules of programming, we find other funding routes to do the same. So we stop creating these problems on the ground that actually create more barriers. And you're starting to see some really interesting deals in the global north. So the deal that Ørsted has just done in America, in the coal mining region of America, with the American trade unions. And they've done a deal that says we will come and do wind farms, but we will also base a percentage of our manufacturing there. And of course, that's the bulk of the jobs when you're talking about wind. It's you know, largely you put it up, and kind of the beauty of it is it does its thing, and you don't need 1,000 miners going down a mine. But they're going to base their manufacturing, and those jobs will be unionised, they'll be better paid, etc., and they'll be based in these former coal mining areas. So some good deals like that, starting to work with companies, a lot of which are in the global north, and getting them to see their responsibilities, not just in their home jurisdiction, but when they operate abroad, and feeding that into our approach in financing as well.
Thank you, Kate. I mean, what you just said reminded me of a program that I followed a while back, where Bernie Sanders is going around doing his township meetings in West Virginia, and it was a fascinating discussion between him and a young coal miner who was really had this deep anxiety about you know, the industry kind of melting away. And one of the things he said was that, well, look, my father, my great grandfather, whatever, you know, my whole generation, you know, we have a certain identity in this industry. And Sanders, you know, responded to him and said, okay, fine, we understand that. But if we were able to train and bring investment in wind and solar and other types of technologies that are going to pay you more, that are higher paying, and etc. And he said, what would you think about that? And the guy said, oh, absolutely. If you had told me that, earlier, I would have voted for you. So that's the issue there, that there is this kind of assumption that somehow people are so locked into these identities of, coal mines and so forth. But there is also a genuine kind of material sort of rationale behind it. Now I'm going to go to Greg, and in some ways it relates to what I was just saying in terms of we need examples of just transitions. So where do we get these examples from? Have we had anything that has operationalized the, weaning away from fossil fuels? Do we have anything to even, when we go to a developing country and say, well, here is an interesting example for you, or a country that's trying to develop fossil fuels, that you shouldn't do that? Because there's this tension between the short term and the long term as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jakob. I think, the first point is that the international labour movement has done a lot of good work identifying what are the principles for a just transition. For instance, the International Trade Union Confederation has done a lot on this. But your question is, let's see this in practice. How can this be applied? What can we learn from that? And I see a growing amount of study of this in the literature. Now, I can't point to a case where there's been a perfect just transition. I don't think such a case will exist. But there are cases where elements of a just transition have been done successfully. So one that often gets highlighted is the Hazelwood coal power plant in Australia, which was due to close down. There was an active process of engagement with the workers, with the local communities, efforts to provide early retirement for workers who wanted it, to reallocate some workers to other power stations in the nearby region, and to provide support for those communities as they went through it, and investment in economic alternatives. Now, this literature, it's been compiled by a number of organizations, but I'd especially highlight the Just Transition Center of the ITUC. If you look that up online, you can find lots of good examples there. There was a very good paper by Annabella Rosenberg published by the Stanley Center with some really good examples. My organization, IISD, has published some examples of coal transitions, what's been successful, what's been unsuccessful, and others have done so as well. So there is an emergent literature of the key lessons of what is working and what isn't working. I think probably one of the most important lessons coming out of this is start planning early, as we're talking about today. Think ahead, and first lesson. And second lesson, talk to people, engage with workers, engage with unions, engage with local community leaders. This is crucial. This can't be imposed from top down. So I think we are getting there. We are learning from examples, but of course we've got a lot further to go.
Thank you, Greg. Let me just, kind of scan through the Q&A that we have, which is kind of building up. If I could sort of pick out, a few. I mean, one was, does northern countries paying southern producers to keep oil and gas in the ground, does it work? I think, we've had that example from, was it Ecuador some 10, 12 years ago? Does anyone want to sort of pick that up and see if we can sort of breathe some life into that thinking?
I mean, look, I'll Greg.
Please.
I mean, look, just very quickly.
Sean,
I mean,
I just spoke. Please go ahead.
the big issue with this is that it reinforces the idea that fossil fuels are valuable resources, and that there is scope for a fossil fuel-led development pathway and time to journey along that, economic diversification pathway, and we know that there isn't, and it's very, very difficult at this stage, particularly when we look at the cost curve for viable production under a 1.5 degree pathway, to determine which resources would have received investment, what they were worth, what oil prices would have done. So even just the basics of understanding what that would look like are not in place. It lends credibility to a concept that should at this stage be fundamentally discredited. So no, it's a problematic discussion in many ways. What there should be, absolutely, and we've already touched on this, is enhanced support for transition and the information and the capacity building that can help developing countries understand transition risks. Because what you have at the moment is a huge asymmetry of information between international partners who have a very sophisticated understanding of risks under different scenarios, and how to, and who also have the opportunity, I should add, to distribute risk across their portfolios across multiple jurisdictions. Countries can't do that. They don't have that flexibility. And in many cases, they also don't have the tools and the information and the awareness to undertake the same analysis and to come to the table with the same information. So this needs to be an absolute priority. Otherwise, there's a real prospect of an accumulation of risk and liabilities in the countries that are least able to manage them.
Thank you, Sean. There was also another question. I mean, did you want to add anything to that, Adrian? Please.
Yes, thank you so much. No, I wanted to really agree with what Sean said. It's like, I think it's key to have that message that the agenda is for developing countries to embrace green growth, not to, stay stuck on the idea that what they really wanted is destructive brown growth. And the internal politics and the internal, institutions and capacity to think about winners and losers and the transition, I think is much more important than geopolitics and framing the question as winning countries and losing countries. It's within the countries, and we can use, and that's my job at the IDB. We use a lot of international funds, gifts from developed countries, basically, to help developing countries build the capacity to manage the transition. So just to give you one example, if you look at the IPCC scenarios that you know very well, a lot of those scenarios, or the IEA, etc., they're built with capacity for modeling and understanding these numbers and looking at these projections that tend to exist, in China, but also mainly in the United States and in Europe. And in Latin America, for instance, we didn't have that much participation to this kind of work. So one of the projects we've done is build the capacity of local universities in 6 different countries in Latin America to use the kind of modeling tools that are already used in Europe and in the US to look at these things, and also to engage with policymakers, to engage with stakeholders from civil society, private sector, from energy, from transport, from housing, from industry, and together discuss, what would it mean for every one of these countries to transition from where they are today to a net zero economy in 2050, what would be the benefits, what would be the challenges, and how those challenges can be addressed. I hope it's not, I'm not being too abstract, but what I'm saying is like there's a lot of opportunity to use that money just to build the capacity and the institutions in the country. I think that's the real urgency.
Thank you, Adrian. I think it fits into what, Sean, you kicked off with this whole question around capacity. You need to really develop national capability in order to be able to harvest the benefits. And there was another question, and it's a question that's also really always plays on my mind, which is that this tension between the conflicting issues. On the one hand, you have this, we talk about urgency, arguing in essence, the urgency kind of takes us towards a more centralized, type of decision making. Quick decisions require that high level type of, whereas, what we are talking about, the just transition requires some, kind of a bottom-up dialogue. How do you reconcile this in terms of the pace, the urgency, we're facing an issue of time in addition to this, almost like a contradiction. Greg.
I think one answer to your question, Jakob, is the concept of momentum. I think it is possible to achieve urgency in a bottom-up way. And that's the way international climate policy is going in any case. To give an example, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is very much inspired by the Powering Past Coal Alliance, is planning to launch in the coming weeks, and a grouping of countries that have ended licensing of new oil and gas exploration and production. And I think the model in this case is a few countries do it, and that just creates incentives and pressure for other countries to join them. The same is true at the subnational level, in terms of communities, in terms of workers, in terms of regions. We as more recognize the urgency and get moving, they will inspire others to join them.
Thank you, Greg. Sean, I think you really want to come into this one. I get that feeling. Is that right, or?
Well, no, I mean, I was going to come back to your earlier comments about how can we do this bottom up. I mean, look, I don't actually think that's the answer. The vast majority of great examples of transition are those very granular, detailed case studies. They're bottom up. The issue is that many of them have, they haven't happened. We don't have this evidence of, transitions at the speed or the scale that we require, right now in order to deliver this transition. And we need a bottom-up and a top-down approach. And we need the large actors and the sources of finance that can support long-term structural reform and drive forwards action at scale. And this is something that the multilateral development banks are working on through the Paris Alignment Working Group, and thinking about learning from past transitions and the role that they can play in scaling up support and indeed developing common principles to guide MDB support for a just transition. So it's thinking about building this coalition and developing this understanding of the ecosystem of actors and the roles of different institutions and individuals within this. So absolutely, we can't do this bottom up. We need top down and bottom up, and coordinated strategic long-term structural reform.
So, I mean, in all of this, what would be then the role of the international community in helping to coordinate this? I know we have this conversation within the UNFCCC about bottom up and trying to figure out, how to manage, the transition. But what is it that can be done at international level that can actually drive this process, or perhaps even accommodate, the range of kind of experiments, that we may have to engage in? Adrian.
Thank you. I think at the international level, the role of the so-called long-term strategies and the comparison of them across countries has a great potential to advance and also to help with this bottom-up versus top-down issue that we just mentioned. I think the top-down part of it is, start from the endpoint. We need to get to net zero emissions by 2050, and we need to do it in a way that is consistent with growth and with a lot of development objectives in developing countries. Otherwise, it's simply not going to happen. So what all countries can do is think about, okay, I need to have a prosperous and net zero emission economy by 2050. That means changes in transport, energy, food systems, cities, and discuss, as we mentioned, with all stakeholders, with academia, with all ministries, not just the Ministry of Environment. What does it mean? How can we move there? Use international help through MDBs, among others, to help fund all the studies, the workshops that you need to do this, but also to share experiences. I think a key limitation of the UNFCCC process right now is that it's framed as negotiations. So what the one country has to do for another country to agree to do another thing. But instead, we should maybe think about another venue or complementing or maybe modifying the UNFCCC, I don't know, to more have like a conference where collegially countries say, okay, this is where we are now. This is what has worked in my country. This is a challenge I'm facing. Maybe another country has resolved similar challenges and has a more robust strategy to net zero already. And I can use that for inspiration and we can collaborate. So yeah, I think those could be some elements to answer the question.
Great. Anyone want to add to that? In terms of, our international system, do we have the politics to even engage in, accommodating, different types of solutions? well, another question that's from the floor is about the faith, building the faith for a just transition. And I suspect, I mean, this comes back to the whole question of politics. Do we have the politics to be able to implement, you know, those ideas? We know that urgent change needs to happen. The first thing that everyone is, of course, looking at is we need to lower the temperature levels, keep it, you know, to below 1.5 degrees. Now, on the one hand, you know, there are those who want to move really fast and who can say, well, actually, you know, if you start messing around with, you know, justice questions and so forth, then that's going to take a long time. But there are others, you know, who say, well, actually, in order to be able to sustain the pace that you are going to build, you're going to have to take populations, you're going to have to take people with you. So, I mean, how much faith do we need to establish for a just transition? Greg.
My feeling is that people want this if governments are prepared to deliver it. I mean, going back to your Bernie Sanders story, Jakob, I hear the same in the UK. There was a survey of oil workers a few months ago, and a majority of them said they were considering jobs outside the oil and gas sector, and of those, more than half said they would be very interested in jobs in offshore wind, for example, in renewables. Yet at the same time, almost none of them had heard the concept just transition. They'd never heard the phrase, and so I think people recognize the urgency of climate change. People want a better future with cleaner and lasting and high quality jobs. And so the onus is much more on government to step up and help create the enabling conditions for that. I'm less concerned about whether we can bring those people with us. I think people want it if it can be delivered.
Thanks, Greg. So, Kate, government has a big role to play here. You are in government.
Absolutely. I think it's also about proving it. I think what Greg said is really true. Our Secretary of State was also at the L7, which is the Labour grouping under the G7, and a similar question was asked of him, and also asked kind of, no one knows what just transition is, and he kind of said it's our job to talk about it and talk about it a lot with people. It doesn't really matter if they don't recognise it as that phrase, because what they're interested in are all the elements of just transition. It doesn't matter if they don't know what the title is. And so I think there is clearly a big role for government to play, but also to prove it on the ground. And I mean, that's what we want to do in COP26 with these interventions that we're asking the multi-development banks and donor countries to adopt, so that we stop making the situation worse, actually. And when you talk to a coal miner, or the South African government are talking to their coal miners, it's that project down the road. That's what we're talking about. You know, that your friends have been hired into, that have got the higher pay and more dignified job. Because I think at the moment, people look around and say, And even in the UK, I mean, obviously there's real concern. Our transition, clearly not about a green transition, but our transition in the 1980s has still left scars. And people are concerned that what it might mean is low pay, gig economy, type jobs, and also that lack of dignity. I think it's something you've touched on, Jakob, but also the EU Commission, and when I've been in Germany or Poland, but if you still talk to our ex-coal mining regions themselves, you know, going and working in a call centre, as important as that is, did not give them the dignity, let alone the ability to sustain their livelihoods, in the way that it must have been quite satisfying coming home, switching on a light and saying, I did that, and knowing that you powered the country, and that real dignified element of jobs that I think a lot of communities feel. They felt it gave them that dignity, and we have to ensure that the future jobs do that we are creating real jobs that produce all those things. Because of course, you know, not all of them will be high paid, but actually if they're quite high quality, that high quality does not necessarily just mean the pay levels, as long as obviously people can live on it. So I think there's a whole range of factors that you need to consider as well when governments are formulating investment strategies, to ensure that they are, you know, real economy jobs, to support better, good mental health. You know, it's an amazing amount of poor mental health you see in office workers, etc., and that we are got the right people in the right place doing the right things for the future.
Great, thank you, Kate. I mean, we're running out of time. I think, you know, we have so many questions that have been raised, and we just can't exhaust all of them. Really interesting ones that we're going to kind of gather them and hopefully digest them a little later with the Bartlett team. If I could just give each one of you 30 seconds each, if that's possible, in terms of, you know, as we're looking at the discussion in the COP, the upcoming COP. I mean, what would you say the key thing that needs to happen in order to be able to drive through, you know, the conversation that we've been having around just transitions? What needs to change in the makeup of our discussions in COP26 in order to be able to pick this issue up? 30 seconds. Who wants to go? Greg.
I'm happy to.
Off we go. Okay.
To use two of my seconds, the survey I mentioned is called Offshore, published by Platform, if anyone wants to look it up. I think the real key here is leadership. And let's focus on the UK as where we are. It's the COP host. I would like to see the UK taking leadership in a managed phase out of oil and gas production. As a first step, that means ending new licensing. And as yet, that is not UK policy, but I would encourage Kate and others in government to be thinking about that. And secondly, supporting other countries in the world to transition their economies away from fossil fuels. These are two things the UK could do on the fossil fuel production agenda that would make a real difference. The UK has already ended international finance for fossil fuel production overseas. And I would like to see the UK go the rest of the way. Thanks, Greg.
Anyone? Kate, what about you? You are in government. What are you guys going to do?
So I think plans. Targets are one thing, but our concern is that there aren't plans underneath to deliver it. And so that means having the right people in the room that are the players that deliver those plans. And that might be climate politicians, but it also might be chancellors, trade unions, employers. So I think it's important to have the right people in the discussion to actually ensure whatever target you're announcing and the leadership that we might be showing actually has a plan underneath it to deliver it.
Thank you, Kate.
Maybe to follow up on that. Yeah,
your 2 cents.
Yeah, you know, I think it's up to heads of states, really. It's like global leaders in every country need to really understand it's their responsibility to do something about climate change now, and really understand that, you know, it means inter alia stopping using fossil fuels. There's really two gaps I see. Like they think they're not in charge, and even when they are sympathetic to the issue, they don't necessarily understand that you cannot at the same time want to stabilize climate change and continue with any kind of fossil fuels.
Thank you, Adrian. Sian, 30 seconds. You are save us.
Well, much of it has been said, but look, I'll just recap this. It's political leadership, it's normalizing phase out, it's setting dates, it's putting this in long-term strategies, and then it's practical support and assistance. So accelerating progress on mainstreaming transition risk in country planning and policy, and in development assistance, and integrating just transition within that. That's my 30 seconds.
Thank you, Sian. Well, I think, you know, we're going to end it here. And I'm also sorry that I didn't manage to call Steve, but we communicated a little bit earlier for him to wrap up. But I think, you know, the last session, the last bit of what you guys said kind of wrapped it up, that there is a real need, desperate need for leadership and communication across different levels. So we have to end it here. Thank you so much to all of you for such a wonderful discussion, and I do hope that we can do this again in some maybe much more of a specific, concrete type of discussion. So thank you very much, and let me remind also viewer participants that recording of the webinar will be available, and of course, future events as part of this campaign can be found in the Bartlett's Together for Climate Action website. So we'll end here, and